Welcome to Cyberpunk Day 2022. I'm Mark Everglade, and I have a special guest, Dr. Joseph Hirchin, who is an author of numerous cyberpunk novels and stories, a college professor of English, and a scholar of cyberpunk literature. Joe, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
So today we're going to look at cyberpunk and martial arts and how the Eastern world and Japanization impacted the genre in the Western world, and how this impacts cyberpunk and dystopian literature and the media, and the relationship between the East and the West in terms of its martial arts, mysticism, and overall philosophy and approach to cyberpunk. Let's take a look at the real world and the virtual world. And so in The Matrix, we're going to use for our first example from the first movie in 1999, what Neo thinks is the real world is just actually a virtual illusion. How can we compare this to our world, which many Eastern mystics also consider an illusion?
Yeah, I mean that's important because when you think about the practice of martial arts, you're thinking about how the body is used, but not just the body, how the mind can hone the body. So it's kind of folly to divorce the practice of martial arts from this more spiritual aspect. I mean, and it goes beyond just meditation. When you talk to martial artists, they'll talk to you about the chi, right? Like harnessing the power of the body, and there's like a spiritual aspect to it. But when we talk about especially cyberpunk's appropriation of martial arts, there's almost like a comedic look. I mean, it's dark comedy that here you'll often have people practicing these martial arts just for the sheer physicality of it. Because hey, if you have a really like sexy martial arts scene in your science fiction book or movie, that's cool. That's spectacle, right? It also gets into that term that you mentioned, Japanization, where you have this move of culture, this culture export. But whenever you export a culture, right, you lose something. Like like when you're translating from one language to the next, or you're moving a cultural practice from the geographical place where it originated to a new place, you're not getting the same thing. So you
Absolutely.
get something that looks like it, right? Like it looks like you're doing karate, but how close are you really to this thing?
Yeah, you definitely mentioned a lot of important points there. And one of the first things you mentioned is in martial arts, you have this idea that the mind and the body and the spirit is all one. It's unified through chi or whatever. And then we see martial arts in virtual reality, and it's like almost like the spirit is an avatar, like this is your ghost in the shell, and that you have the virtual self and the actual self united into one. And I think we see that in movies like THX and The Matrix, when we're downloading information from virtual reality into our mind in the virtual world, but then in real life, we actually end up knowing that information too and absorbing it, such as when Neo says, I know Kung Fu.
Yeah, I know Kung Fu, but there's a kind of a joke. It took him 10 hours to get the download. I think that's like the 90s version of science fiction, like getting martial arts, like, hardwired to your brain. Like it only takes 10 hours.
Sure. When now all the world's martial arts knowledge could be downloaded in 30 seconds on a flash drive.
Boom, we got it.
Right.
But okay, the thing is, not only do you get the download, but you again, we see like the cultural appropriation with the Matrix, because it's not that Neo can do Kung Fu, right? Who cares, right? Anybody can do it now. If you have 10 hours to recline in your chair, you're good. The importance is how fast can you do it? And so what this does is it westernizes an Eastern practice. Think about the West's ideal of everything now, everything fast. I don't want food. I want fast food, right? I don't want to live. I want to live fast. Everything's fast.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
So your martial arts also has to be fast. If it's not fast, it's not good. So Matrix, we're in like bullet time, right? Everything has to go so fast that you can't even see it.
That the rest of the world looks slow by comparison.
Absolutely. So
And
the question
yeah.
is that martial arts? Well, it's science fiction martial arts.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things here, and the one is certainly Jean Piaget was one of the most famous American psychological educators. Looking at and in all of his studies, the U.S. government kept asking him, "How can we make kids learn faster?" And it was the speed, the quantity over the quality that was the most important. So that's really, it's definitely like you're saying, the Western approach to education. And I think of John Searle's a Chinese room experiment, his thought experiment, where you have a man behind a door and he knows he has a Chinese dictionary, and he's speaking through the door to somebody else, and he's translating with the dictionary and saying everything perfectly through because he's got a translator and he's got a dictionary in his hand. But does he really know Chinese if he's just looking up this knowledge and regurgitating it? Is that actually a knowledge of Chinese? Perhaps it's a knowledge of Chinese, but it's not an experience of Chinese. Perhaps Neo can do martial arts, but he's not experiencing it because the journey to get to that point, the journey of growth that it would take to obtain a martial arts, a significant level of expertise, all the mental discipline is missing. So you end up with the result and no discipline to behind it, no work ethic behind it. In fact, it's so effortless that it may seem almost meaningless to him because he didn't have to work for it.
Well, and that resonates with a cyberpunk theme of uh, like not caring about the body. If you think about our texts for cyberpunk, we go to Neuromancer, we go to William Gibson. You have Case, who treats the body as, we all know it's meat, right? Who cares? You want the exhilaration of cyberspace. That's what you live for. And if you are, unfortunately tethered to the real world for any amount of time, you just need to do some drugs, right? So that you can have a sort of cyberspatial experience, even if you're not jacked in. But the issue, though, if we think about, okay, what was William Gibson doing, though? Why do we get all of a sudden, the East filtering into the West? Well, I think a good image is the bank is no longer Bank of America in that text. It's the Mitsubishi Bank of America. And so what this reflects is it reflects this economic, cultural, and even quasi-spiritual export of Japanese culture. The Japanese after World War II were hamstrung, couldn't have a standing army, right? Mm-hmm. But they could develop technology, right? They could develop their economy. They could export their culture, and they do, right? But by the 80s, you have the West really wanting to take on a lot of the practices that had allowed Japan to become such a economic global power, and so part of that is the symbolism is let's do martial arts, right? If you're doing martial arts, then you're taking on this total practice of what it is to be Japanese.
Yes, and definitely. And so in Japan, after World War II, the economy is different, and basically they're using technology to supplement the economy and basing their entire economy around technology until the 70s, when they're able to compete in the automobile industry and start making a major dent on world economics and becoming a world economic power, one of the top four. And what's interesting here is that in the cyberpunk literature, that or rather some of the anime and whatnot that comes out of Japan, you also see the same idea of technology being the solution that allows a weaker individual to empower themselves through technology, through cybernetic augmentations, and through other things, in order to make up that difference. Technology making up the difference, basically, so that in Shadowrun, a street samurai with the right augmentations can actually take down a guy who's got machine guns loaded into his arms.
Yeah, and I've noticed in your most recent novel, Inertia, you participate in this. You've got like what, cyber warriors with cyber swords, right? Do you want to talk about like how does that fit in to what we're talking about?
Well, Severum in the book, he is getting older. He's about 70. People lived because of telomere enhancements. People live maybe twice as long then. But has so many war injuries that he's feeling his every bit of his age, and he's always resisted using any kind of enhancements, neural enhancements, augmentations, etc. But finds that he has to offset the kind of impotence that comes with his age and with cybernetic augmentations like a titanium fist, for instance, that's powered. And so that is an idea, again, of the vulnerable population here, in this case, a wounded veteran who's older, using this technology to make up the difference. But he also realizes, more importantly, that he has to change his approach to situations, whereby he used to be able to just intimidate people by coming up to them and stating his demands. And in multiple cases, whether he's dealing with a next door neighbor or a weapons dealer in the book, these strategies fall in their face, and he has to actually learn to listen and be charismatic when he speaks instead of just demanding.
So he actually then figures as a kind of a character that realizes, hey, the West has been about doing things fast, like taking control, like asking questions later, but it doesn't work. It's like it only works so far. So he actually maybe has a little bit of more of a certainly self-conscious component to his character, but could we say that he takes on more meditative practices and
over time, yeah,
establishes like what like an actual martial arts should be, rather than the version of martial arts that has kind of come down to cyberpunk?
Yeah, because over time, the sort of mystic wisdom that he thought was absurd becomes much more palatable over time, because he realizes that he was looking for certainty earlier in life, but realizes that life is very uncertain, and that in more abstract knowledge, the mind can expand and grow. And we see this mysticism everywhere, even outside of cyberpunk. We see it in Star Wars with the Force,
Absolutely.
which is very similar to the idea of Tao, of course, or perhaps even Logos.
And you've got the yogi figure in Yoda, right? I mean, like
Sure.
Almost comical that you got the yogi Yoda, right? Because here's a spiritual master who can teach you the way, right? You can learn how to harness this energy if only you have this enlightened master. And this is again hearkening back to ideas of Eastern mysticism.
Sure, where you're stripping the world of its illusions, and then here you have cyberpunk, who's basically, as a postmodern genre, it also wants to deconstruct and strip the world of its illusions. But the illusions of cyberpunk are not, say, the illusions of desire that cause the illusions in cyberpunk that they're stripping are that the social institutions and corporations are actually acting somehow in your best interests. I think that's what cyberpunk really shines a light on. It's a very dark light, and strips away that illusion, that superstructure.
And it's certainly, those structures are more visible in cyberpunk. You go into cyberspace, and if we go back to Neuromancer, you see the stepped pyramids, right, and the burning lights of the like the military industrial complex and the banks, right? These are ubiquitous and visible in this world. And I think that there's something there that that space is flattened, right? And when you have these cyber figures, whether it's a cyber samurai or the image of a sword, or just martial arts in general, it means that there's been a conquest of space, right? And that goes back to this Japanization, where you have the East actually becoming everywhere, right? Like in the same way that these corporations are now everywhere, if you have cyberspace, here, whether here is like Alaska or India or, mainland China, it doesn't matter. These entities are always with you.
And so there's definitely that idea of, stereotype, this stereotype of the martial artist as someone who's spiritual. But we see something different in Johnny Mnemonic when Gibson puts this together, because the Yakuza there don't have any spiritual values whatsoever.
Yeah.
They're just a mafia that are adopting this. They're adopting the martial arts without any of the, say, spiritual values of Kung Fu, for instance. And so there are ideas and a question in the community regarding the cultural appropriation of ideas, whereby cultural appropriation being that when ideas are stolen from one group and used with or without the intention to reinforce inaccurate stereotypes, just to make sales or get page views. So I think of the last Blade Runner movie, which was heavily criticized for cultural appropriation for its uses of Japanese stereotypes, where they pretty much minimize Japan's contribution to the world as being a digital geisha. And so this idea that everybody in Asia is a kung fu artist, or every woman in Asia is a geisha, how do you see this cultural approbation of cyberpunk? And is this something that people should be concerned about or not?
First, we think about the ubiquity, right? It's everywhere. If we think about cyberpunk, what isn't everywhere is the sort of governmental power that we expect. So that's gone, but what is present is like a way of being. And so we ask why, like, why is it that we've lost, these governments, but now we've gained just like the individual. And I think that part of it is because cyberpunk is interested in pushing past limits, right? So one of those limits would just be, if we think in the world of political science, right? We're thinking we're moving past economic barriers. We're moving past political barriers, and we're moving past bodily barriers as well. And I think that martial arts is a good sort of locus for that discussion. There's a philosopher, George Bataille. He insists that organisms' growth or expansion always runs up against limits. And cyberpunk is interested in saying, no, why is there a limit? You already mentioned that in your world, you have telomere therapy. And so you have characters that, hey, they're living double their span of life. And that's participating in this same trope that says, let's abolish the barriers. Let's think about a world where you can do anything. But at the same time, like, cyberspace itself is its own barrier. So there's this kind of there's this weird irony that while we're pursuing a world with no barriers, we enter a world that, even though, like, okay, you can technically be anywhere in cyberspace, you can also be nowhere, right?
Yeah.
Here you are always in your room when you're in cyberspace. So, like, even though you feel like you're moving everywhere, you're really moving nowhere.
Because when you model something, the model can never be as accurate or as expansive as the original. And so cyberspace is basically somewhere where you have more restrictions, more boundaries than you do in the real world, simply because a simulation of something else is a summarization. It's a model.
And it links to this idea that if you practice martial arts, this doesn't give you like the ability really just to like punch anybody to death, right?
Sure.
It actually gives you the responsibility to not punch people to death.
Sure.
Like, that's the idea. The practice is supposed to actually result in self-control. But I don't think that science fiction reflects that aspect of martial arts. I think that it does what you're talking about with the Yakuza and Johnny Mnemonic, where it's mostly a visual symbol of power.
Yeah, and it's actually probably much more difficult to maintain a high level of self-control when angry. And especially the sorts of situations these characters are in, life and death, to maintain self-control and be able to negotiate would be far more, far more difficult and far more of a challenge than to just beat someone's ass. But again, there's no appeal to that as far as the action scenes. And in the latest Matrix movie kind of satirizes that whole thing. It breaks the fourth wall right from the start, and it looks at, okay, we're going to have an action scene here, and we're going to have to do this because it's obligatory.
Yeah, it's interesting as well to think about how the Western appropriation of martial arts and science fiction, it never usually gives us an Asian character that is practicing martial arts. It's almost always usually the white figure. Why is it always a Westerner doing this?
Because it's assumed that an Asian would already know it by default because of the stereotype. And so they wouldn't be learning anything, because most of the authors who are and media creators that are writing about Japan have probably never taken a 20-hour trip over the ocean to go to Japan and to see anything different. And so they get a summarization of stereotypes, and then they regurgitate these stereotypes in a cycle. And without breaking out of that, it's just not considered a phenomenal achievement, because again, they assume that those people are, or they assume that the people of Asiatic origin already know that. When in fact, I don't know what the percent is, but I imagine the percent who are practicing this is pretty minor.
Something that I kind of think is also fascinating, if we go back or stay on Neo and his learning of kung fu. I know kung fu, right? Well, for 10 hours he's reclining in like a medical chair, yes. So it's this kind of Western hubris that, hey, I can actually just chill out in my living room and lay down and I can learn all the secrets of your culture in a matter of hours. And then all of a sudden I'm actually going to be doing it just as well, or maybe better. I'm going to be the one. I'm going to be the person who does this as no one else has done it. And I'm going to learn it by just being a lazy Westerner.
Right. Or like you mentioned, in the Diamond Age, where we're learning to basically cook Asian food and do backflips and navigate the world just by opening up a children's book, a digital primer.
Okay, now the opposite image is, okay, Neo's not learning this, he's being colonized by it. We could make this argument that he thinks he's learning it, but really he's getting colonized by this kind of Eastern practice. But that argument doesn't quite hold up, because he does become the master. So yes. It's more like the Western fantasy. The Western fantasy that no matter how much time it might have taken someone else in the world to master some special art, it can be yours by reading a For Dummies book, right? Right. Just take a few hours, and all the secrets of the East can be yours.
And it does diminish the hero's journey to some degree. But I think that's why they have to have that training scene there in order to restore the idea of the mentor teaching the student. Otherwise, the hero's journey is lost when you can just download it.
Yeah, right. I mean, but that has its own problem, because the mentor is your token African American figure in the Matrix. Mm-hmm. To become the master, you have to learn, from a person of color, so that they can later get out of the way, so that the white hero can do his thing.
Sort of like Jimmy Page taking all Robert Johnson's riffs and creating Led Zeppelin, and then nobody knows who Robert Johnson is. Well,
Jimmy Page is excellent, because he also, before he formed Led Zeppelin, he took a trip out to India. So not only did he appropriate the African American musical tradition. He also goes out, to Kashmir, right? That's one of his most
Sure,
important songs. He goes out to the
sure.
Kashmir region and he soaks that up too. So he,
Hmm.
that's the perfect image of the white hero appropriating.
How is training in virtual reality going to be used in the future, do you think? As far as like you look at skills that are that trends in learning and development where skills are being learned and taught in virtual reality, whether it's somebody playing Guitar Hero and thinking that they can play guitar, or building of muscle memory through haptic feedback, etc. So do you think that this type of training in virtual reality, like the Kung Fu Studio, that something like that might be useful? You write about this in your book, Taekwondo, where you have fights going on, and they're sort of like in a sort of augmented reality, and people are leveling up, etc.
Yeah, it's a great question. No doubt there's going to be money to be made in this, right? Like the future of education is, hey, put on the mirror shades, let's do you know the driving simulation. Let's do the kung fu simulation. Let's do the eat with chopsticks simulation. Like if whatever you want to do, you'll run the program. And I think that this is similar to, you play with these ideas in hemispheres and inertia as well. That you just download a particular like application
Sure.
that helps you do whatever it is that you're wanting to do. No, but your question though is like, will it work? Right? Is it viable? Uh,
Right.
I mean, do you think that kind of remains to be seen, or like, does it matter? Like, how much money do you have to pay? Like, are you buying the freeware, or are
I
you
think,
like,
yeah, right. I think that for physical task, it's definitely a viable solution. But this has gone all the way to soft skills, whereby virtual environments are now being used to train, say, customer service agents on how to communicate with people and resolve conflict by communicating with an AI in a virtual setting? It's a
right?
safe setting to practice these things, and it requires, no investment. After the initial investment, you don't have to pay a trainer. It makes sense to the company, but I think that the results are still unproven as to how well these things can have an ecological validity. That is, how well do they represent the real world and all of its fickleness?
Just like air flight, that whole sector is experiencing a problem because the military is not training people to fly
Mhm.
as much now, and you have to have your 10,000 hours before you're a licensed pilot. So they're not training people because they're using drones, and you don't
Mhm.
put a real person in a drone. You pilot it, virtually.
Mhm.
And so can those drone pilots like land a Boeing 747? Maybe, but legally they can't without putting in those 10,000 hours. So there you have a problem that even though um, the virtual reality training could be fine, even though it could give you those skills that you need, and you could operate effectively. Um, we don't recognize it. Legally, it's not recognized right now. Um, what is it? What does it take for the real world to catch up to the virtual world? Maybe we could end by just considering that scene in the first Star Wars movie, right? The original Star Wars movie, where you have Darth Vader and Obi-Wan in their duel, right? It starts out, Darth Vader says, "When I left you, I was but a learner. Now I'm a master, only a master of evil, Darth." Um, and they have this battle, and they're doing a samurai thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Right.
this is lifted straight from Japanese samurai movies. And why is it? Partially it's symbolic. Um, a true to be a true master, like you got to have a sword fight. And this is just a trope that sticks with us in science fiction. Star Wars is such an important text for science fiction. You can't escape it. You can't escape this vision of dudes fighting with swords. So I think that just it informs what science fiction writers do 40 or 45 or 50 years later. It's like, oh, you're going to have a fight. You're going to show that you have mastery over both the individual self and the world around you. Then you got to have a sword. It can be an energy sword. It can be a cyber sword. It could be the real, steel katana, but there's got to be a sword. You have to perform martial arts,
Sure.
if you're doing science fiction.
And definitely when in sci-fi and when you're looking at space, especially, people are seeking the exotic, and they're trying to figure out, how do I convey something that's so exotic as space, another planet, and so they seek those cultures that seem exotic to them. And nowhere is more exotic, perhaps, than some parts of Africa, the far, far east. And so, trying to get something that's as different from today's life as possible, it has to be sourced from somewhere. I'm not sure to the degree that people are actually creative. Every idea that they believe they're creating has some basis in reality, and they're just recombining everything they've ever experienced, really.
Absolutely. And this idea of Japan itself, they've only ever lost one war in the history of Japan.
Wow.
World War II, that's it. They were never invaded. They were never colonized. They're this almost like mythically strong people. So, if you take on their practices, you're also taking on that kind of mythic symbolism of, the great warrior, the undefeated. And so when we're in Star Wars and Darth Vader, swings his lightsaber at Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan kind of like, he meditates, right? He goes into himself, and even before the lightsaber hits him, boom, he's vanished. He's already become a Force ghost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's more of this trope that I think still defines the genre, that this highest plane of existence is achieved through meditation, through going inward, which cyberspace is kind of like a approximation of that. You go inside these various nodes and networks to really see what's inside of yourself. You're vanishing from the real world so that you can explore the inner world, the inner world of the unconscious.
So I want to thank you for your time. This has been Cyberpunk Day 2022. Join us next year for more events, and join us throughout Cyberpunk Day. We're going to have a lot of everything from video game developers, video game demos, and a lot of the biggest names in Cyberpunk being interviewed and talking about everything that makes the genre special to you as a community with your involvement throughout. Thank you, and have a great day.